I sat nervously in my OBGYN's exam room, covered only by a paper gown. No one could tell me why I hadn't been able to get pregnant, so I was preparing to turn to the bright promise of in vitro fertilization. I didn't know then that would become a frustrating, fruitless, and expensive odyssey, nor did I know anything about the dark side of assisted reproduction, a highly profitable industry that operates largely under the radar. After several years of pumping my body full of hormones for monitored cycles and treatments, my husband and I had nearly spent $50,000 without the joy of having a child. Unlike the pictures of smiling parents and their new babies posted on clinic websites and social media feeds, I came away from IVF at 40 with a battered heart and a bloated body, a biohazard container full of spent syringes, and a folder containing fuzzy black and white images of embryos that were never to blossom into children. As Pamela's story illustrates, infertility is a painful form of suffering that is often unseen. Matthew Anderson and Andrew Walker, authors for the Gospel Coalition, say, "The quiet heartbreak and pain of infertility is well known to many evangelicals, whose aspirations to have a child have been frustrated for reasons they cannot understand or control. It is frequently a secret burden that couples carry, which only emerges into the open as they reveal their struggles to families, friends, and doctors. Infertility is a disease characterized by the failure to establish a clinical pregnancy after 12 months of regular, unprotected sexual intercourse or due to an impairment person of capacity to reproduce. 1 in 8 couples in the U.S. face infertility. Assisted reproductive technologies, ART, include all fertility treatments in which both eggs and embryos are handled. In vitro fertilization is the most effective and popular ART. On average, one cycle of IVF can cost $12,000 to $18,000. By all criteria of biology and scientific revelation, life begins at conception. According to the American Pregnancy Association, IVF is a process of stimulating egg production, extracting mature eggs from a woman's ovary, manually fertilizing the eggs with sperm in the laboratory, and then introducing some of the resulting embryos into a woman's uterus. The average live birth rate for IVF is 39%. It takes most couples 3 cycles to achieve pregnancy. There are 4 options for the remaining embryos. First, a couple may choose cryopreservation, the cooling and storing of cells, tissues, or organs at very low temperatures to maintain their viability. The Pacific Fertility Center says, embryo freezing is a very routine part of IVF, and about 60% of patients end up with some embryos in storage. A second option is to dispose of the remaining embryos. A third option is to donate the embryos to science, in which the embryos are consequently destroyed. The fourth option is embryo donation, where a couple can sell their embryos to other couples. Procreating human life is not only an immensely fragile process, but also an exceedingly risky procedure that can have extensive harmful effects for the mother and the baby. For the mother, pregnancies from IVF are more likely to be subject to complications than through ordinary conception. Sir Robert Edwards was the inventor of the first embryo through IVF. The first IVF baby, Louise Brown, was born in 1978 in Oldham, England. 1 million in vitro babies have been born in the U.S. between 1987 and 2015, and 8 million worldwide. About 4 million IVF births are annually reported in the U.S. A recent study found that Americans do not see IVF as a moral issue. Adults across religious traditions, including evangelicals, are more likely to say that IVF is not a moral issue than they are to take a position for or against it. Gareth Jones, author of Bioethical Books, says, IVF is a textbook example of a procedure that initially was regarded as outrageous, but has now become part of a routine medical treatment. There is disagreement in some quarters, but on the whole, it is generally accepted. Infertility is a clinical illness, but it is also a spiritual and emotional burden, because infertile Christians often wonder if God is withholding a blessing. Psalm 127:3 says, "Children are a gift of the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward." However, just because God gives children as a reward does not mean that he withholds children as a punishment. Anderson and Walker add, the weight of infertility and the value of children have increasingly prompted infertile couples to pursue procreation by every means possible. IUI, IVF, and even surrogacy have all found their way into evangelical communities. While Christians have become increasingly aware of the emotional challenges infertility poses, we have not yet considered the hidden costs of our desperate pursuit through arts. Because IVF is a complex and sensitive issue with ethical, moral, and spiritual ramifications, Christians should cautiously weigh these matters before pursuing it. IVF has many ethical concerns. However, this procedure can be morally acceptable if approached in an ethical way. IVF is a multifaceted issue that deserves great consideration and attention. First, IVF has many ethical issues. One concern is that IVF was born from the desire to have autonomy over procreation. Autonomy is self-directing freedom, especially moral independence, and it is not sinful in and of itself. The point at which it becomes sinful was when one desires independence from God. In 2003, Robert Edwards, inventor of IVF, told a reporter, "I wanted to find out exactly who was in charge, whether it was God himself or whether it was scientists in a laboratory. His conclusion, it was us." Edwards mistakenly determined that humans are ultimately in control of life, especially over its creation. Stephanie Gray, pro-life activist and co-founder of the Canadian Center for Bioethics, says, "IVF allows for control and perfection in a way natural conception does not." IVF involves a third party, the doctors that fertilize the eggs. Does the addition of a third party coincide with God's design for procreation? Gray says, "Humans are created with an incredible power to facilitate the creation of a new human life made in the image of the divine. Couples ought to treat this with great reverence and responsibility." Consider this statement by a couple enduring IVF. As we looked at each other, we had the palpable sense that this process felt completely unlike the warm, united, and loving way children are usually conceived. This felt unnatural, sterile, and strange. Does this patient's experience of the unnatural and strange nature of IVF give any hint to its ethical permissibility? IVF has also grown into a thriving industry. As stated before, one cycle of IVF can cost $12,000 to $18,000, not including required fertility drugs, cryopreservation, nor various add-ons. The global IVF market size was valued at $16.68 billion in 2018 and is expected to grow to $36.2 billion by 2026. Medical News Today says that IVF has evolved in many parts of the world as a profit-generating industry that values the money brought in by immediate gains of pregnancy and live birth over long-term considerations about the health of mothers and children. The industry's commercially driven focus and lack of independent oversight continue to raise questions and concerns. NBC News Today reveals that clinics are not required to report problems unless there is a complaint filed or negative news media report. Many clinics have attempted to cover up IVF mix-ups, where embryologists transfer an embryo to the wrong mother. How many IVF mix-ups have been hidden from the public? How many fertility clinics have ended thousands of embryos' lives due to storage malfunction? These are issues that Christians need to contemplate. IVF not only bears the title of an industry, but also uses industry terminology, the language of commodity. Consider the standard IVF vocabulary: discarded, donated to research, put into storage, great quality, and leftover. These words do not acknowledge that embryos are human beings. Can society engage in this behavior and language and not be affected by it? Amy Hall, writer with Stand to Reason, says, "This view of humans as commodities we can pick and choose, commodities with an instrumental value that varies according to our preferences, will not remain confined to embryonic humans. Instrumental views of one kind of human have a way of bleeding over into our views of others. Newborns, the elderly, if they are not meeting our discerning tastes as consumers, then surely we should not be saddled with them." Even if Christians manage to use IVF responsibly, do they want to be a part of this industry, contributing to it and making IVF even more commonplace so more people use it irresponsibly? IVF is inconsistent with pro-life views. If Christians hold that abortion, the killing of life in the womb, is wrong, then they should hold that the disposal, or killing of an embryo in IVF, is also wrong. Since 1991, over 1.7 million embryos have been sacrificed in the production of creating life, created just to be destroyed. Does this not seem contradictory? Norman Geisler, author of Christian Ethics, says, "Through IVF, humans are knowingly causing the deaths of small humans to get one that will develop." Christians who are facing infertility should be aware of the common practice of embryonic disposal so they can make choices that will preserve the lives of children. IVF also implements a eugenic process through PGD, Preimplantation genetic diagnosis, where DNA from the embryo is screened for genetic condition. It is used to reduce risks or avoid transmission of a genetic disease or chromosomal abnormality. Thomas Baldwin, member of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, says, PGD is a method of selecting which embryos to place in a woman, and thus equally a method of rejecting embryos because they are thought to be unsuitable. It is a way of determining which embryos are to have a chance at becoming children, if they implant successfully, and which children are not to have this chance. As such, it gives rise to significant social and ethical considerations concerning the role of human intervention in determining which kinds of children are to be born or not. Robert Edwards, inventor of IVF, said, "Soon it will be a sin for parents to have a child that carries the heavy burden of a genetic disease. We are entering a world where we have to consider the quality of our children." Genesis 1:27 says that man is made in the image of God, giving value and worth to every human. Because we bear God's image, human life is sacred in a way no other living thing is. Christians considering IVF must be vigilant in guarding against the evils of eugenics. However, there is another side to this issue. Second, while standard practice of IVF raises concerns, there are ways to navigate the process to avoid ethical violations. Wayne Grudem, best-selling Christian author, says, "In principle, the teachings of Scripture present no moral objection to a couple using IVF, as long as no embryos are destroyed, because it is simply enabling an infertile couple to overcome their infertility and thereby experience the blessings of children. To use IVF ethically, a couple can request that only one embryo be created. This specific request avoids creating spare embryos. As stated earlier, embryo disposal options such as freezing, donating, or destroying them create moral trepidation. By intentionally creating one embryo, a couple will not have to face these ethical challenges. Another way to utilize IVF ethically is to reject PGD. Alternatively, a couple can choose to freeze the woman's eggs and the man's sperm so that they may conceive later. By doing this, a couple can avoid creating life that they do not intend to bring to full term. Considering these options before pursuing IVF can help couples remain faithful to biblical and moral principles. Thirdly, IVF is a multifaceted issue that deserves great consideration and attention. If one decides that IVF is morally unacceptable, an alternative is adoption and embryo adoption. Embryo adoption is when an embryo is implanted into another woman's uterus. In James 1:27, God calls all his children to care for those who are fatherless and motherless. It is estimated that there are 153 million orphans in the world and 1 million embryos in storage in the U.S. alone. This sad reality presents Christians millions of opportunities to honor the Lord and receive the blessings of children. Another alternative to IVF is NAPRO technology. Natural procreative technology is a restorative approach to infertility that first seeks to find the underlying cause of infertility and then works to restore health to the couple so that they can naturally achieve a healthy pregnancy. As opposed to IVF, NAPRO seeks to heal the infertile rather than bypass complications by controlling variables. Through NAPRO, a couple that is infertile can still have a chance at conceiving naturally without going through an invasive procedure. IVF is an incredibly complicated technology that poses significant ethical challenges. While abortion deaths may take the headlines, IVF deaths go unnoticed. Because of the lack of IVF knowledge, Christians have been faced with unanticipated and impossible decisions. Christians have a responsibility to have grounded biblical convictions on issues like IVF. Dr. J. Clint Parker, chair of the Medical Ethics Committee at Venant Medical Center, says, "Authenticity in action is important for Christians because our moral acts and character are not abstractions, but represent something very personal, a form of worship, a way of reflecting God, an expression of love. Some may say that since God is the author of all life, can he not use whatever means he chooses to bring about that life? Yes, but God does not contradict himself. Standard IVF protocol includes the disposal of precious life. Christians know that God commands us not to take life. Because IVF practices this routinely, it will be morally wrong to participate in IVF under these conditions. One may also question, if God calls us to be fruitful and multiply, should we not seek to follow his command? Of course, Christians should desire to fulfill all of God's commands, but the good desire for children can be distorted. This is accurate if having children requires a process contrary to scriptural principles. The scriptural command to follow God supersedes the command to be fruitful and multiply. In IVF, the right desire for children does not justify the immoral means of embryo destruction. In conclusion, it is of utmost importance for Christians to prayerfully consider IVF. Because IVF is a complex and sensitive issue with ethical, moral, and spiritual ramifications, Christians should cautiously weigh these concerns before pursuing it. IVF has many ethical concerns. However, this procedure can be morally acceptable if approached in an ethical way. IVF is a multifaceted issue that deserves great consideration and attention. Jennifer Lau, founder and president for the Center for Bioethics, says, "While grieving with those who struggle with infertility, Christians still need to look more carefully at today's reproductive technologies such as IVF in light of our beliefs about God, our life, our bodies, and our children." Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. You started out with taking a definitive stance against IVF, but changed your thesis to examine both sides. Why?
So, some of you may know that I did change my thesis, or my opinion on my thesis, earlier from the beginning of my junior year to the end of my junior year. I held an opposing opinion on it, and then I took the summer off to get a fresh perspective on it, and I came back after doing a lot of research, and I have found out that there is a way to only fertilize one embryo. So that's what changed my perspective, and I wanted to give a more holistic and realistic approach to IVF.
What is the biggest obstacle to the acceptance of embryo adoption?
I would assume it would be equivalent to adoption as well. I know that with embryo adoption, you do run the risk of the embryo not implanting, so I would say that that would be the biggest obstacle.
In what ways is God's design for conception superior to IVF despite its flaws?
I think God's natural design for procreation is that a man and a woman are united in one way, and that child is conceived out of love, and then it's just the way that God designed it, so we know it's ordained from God, and that is a biblical stance on procreation.
Thank you, Emma.